This conference will now be recorded.
Play from start. And slideshow. How'd you get around not having the slideshow be full screen so you can still see everything?
So what was that?
I'm trying to launch the slideshow, and I have to launch the slideshow before I share my screen, and once I do, I can't see everybody else. Here, I'll try swapping to a different window. Play from current slide. No.
What I realized is at least on mine, I could click set up slideshow, and I can switch it to there's an option to switch it from being a normal slideshow that takes up your whole screen to just putting it in a single window.
Right.
And that worked.
Yeah, that's kind of, I see that option, but it's there. Screen. Title. Use presenter view. No, that's subtitles. Maybe there's an option here where it doesn't go full screen. Has everyone found a light so far?
Yes.
Yes, I have one.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. We
Yeah.
will get into that soon. Great. I'm just trying to figure out how Andrew managed to run the
Here,
slideshow without it consuming his entire screen.
So you're on a Mac, right?
Yeah.
So I went to top menu, slideshow, setup show, and when it says show type, I did browsed by an individual in parentheses window.
There we go. Got it. Okay.
And then once I did that just put it in one single window. But
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
That worked. Thank you, Andrew.
Yep, no problem. It was useful for me to just pop in at the beginning.
Applications and PowerPoint and okay. Are we still seeing faces or just my screen?
I'm seeing faces and the slide.
Okay. Perfect. So I'm running a couple third-party softwares, so it kind of bounces around to a couple of different things for me. Okay. So let's jump right into it for session 4, everyone. Thank you for coming back. We appreciate it. I always keep thinking that after we throw so much information your way that someone's going to run away and be like, screw this. But everyone is stuck with us, and that's great. Hopefully you're learning something. Hopefully this is entertaining for you too. Before I delve into my presentation, I know Andrew wanted to follow up on your assignment from session 3.
Yeah, so I'm not going to be able to hang around for very long this afternoon because I actually have screenplays in my summer screenwriting class that I have to go review. But I want to check in with anyone to see if you had any, how your shot list assignment went. how you're feeling about that. I know I had left notes for most of the screenwriters. I didn't get everybody's scripts, but I saw that most of you either had a script done or had at least started something and left a few notes there. So obviously, if you're still writing, you may not be ready to get into the shot list yet. But I wanted to check if you had any questions. I did see a Jenny and Nick sent a message. So I'm just going to go ahead and share the question with everyone. The question about in the shot list option for montage. So I actually wanted to pull up. I'm looking to see. Yeah, okay. So when you under the type, the drop-down menu next to type, there are all kinds of different shot options like wide, very wide, blah blah blah. And down there is a montage type. And you were asking what that meant in the list there, and if you want to clarify, you can. But I think what you're asking is that what you would mark your shot if it was for a montage? If you're like doing a series of shots for a montage, is that what you meant? Okay, I got a yes. So yeah, I get. I would probably
We
use
have
it that
a puppy
way.
and she sometimes gets noisy, so we're typing some of the questions instead of trying to,
Sure.
just so you know, that's why we're typing
Okay.
most of our stuff right now.
Oh, no problem.
Okay.
No problem. So yeah, you could use it that way. I wouldn't get too bogged down in that. Shot lists are one of those forms that is not as rigid in filmmaking, film production as other forms of communication. So screenplays have a real rigid format. Call sheets have a real rigid format. Schedules have a real rigid format. There's a lot of variety in shot lists. People do different. It's really a personal thing, usually between the director and the director of photography or the cinematographer, to decide sort of what kind of nomenclature they want to use in there. So I think you could use that if you're trying to capture, like you have a number of shots and you want to make sure that it's clear to yourself, you're remembering kind of what goes with what, that these are all shots within a montage. And a montage is, we usually use that term. It's also known as a series of shots. It's when you have, a bunch of quick scenes in succession, like often set to music. I have a friend who used to refer to it, because of the movie Revenge of the Nerds, as the nerds building stuff scene. And so it's usually that time where like a character grows or learns a new skill, or a group comes together, and over usually kind of the duration of a song, you get a bunch of the shots of the passage of time and things changing. And oftentimes in screenwriting, you'll use, rather than making each of those its own scene with a slug line, you might say series of shots or montage sequence and list it as like a bullet list of things you have to capture. Now that does make it a little messy for the production manager, because now they are missing those slug lines for the scheduling, and a production manager needs to know, all right, now I got to insert extra scenes in there. But as a script, it reads cleaner, trying to figure out, all right, this is the montage sequence. But that said, in terms of your shot list, I would just mark it however is clearest for you. If you select montage there, you obviously can't select one of the other options. So those are the different types of shots in terms of like a master or a close-up, or any of those. So I would say if it's useful for you to put montage there, go ahead and just put in the description. Make sure you note what kind of shot is it. Is a close-up or a wide? But whatever works for you. Like I said, Celtics also, their shot list tool is not my favorite that I've seen out there, but it's convenient, for you all who are, many of you doing this sort of as a first time thing. It's useful just to get your ideas recorded in some place. But other things you can do, I mean, some people just pull up an Excel spreadsheet and they just write out their shots that way. So it really is whatever you want to do and what works best for you. Any other questions about the shot list exercise?
Doesn't sound like it.
All right.
Okay.
Well, I will probably not see you all again until Thursday. So good luck with your shoots. Hope it all goes well. If any questions do come up, you all have my email in the previous slides, and so feel free to shoot me an email or ask Kurt, and Kurt can pass the questions on either way. So have a great afternoon session, and best of luck with your shoots. Look forward to seeing them.
Okay, great. So today we get to talk about some fun stuff. We get to talk about how to go about actually filming and how to use light. And we will also have a guest at the end, a buddy of mine for about 20 years, Chairman Barnes, who is a Hollywood actor, one of those character actor types where you may not know the name, but when you see him, you'll be like, oh, I think I know that guy from that one show, or that didn't I see him in a commercial or a movie or something like that. There's a lot of people out there like Chairman who are doing the human's work when it comes to acting in the background. Not everyone can be Tom Cruise. So welcome back, everybody. This is essentially the session to teach you how you're going to take all of that pre-production work that you have done in prep and actually grab your camera and get to work. Now, it sounded like most everyone's going to be using phones, which is great. If you have cameras, though, that works too. But I would like everyone to follow along. You don't have to turn on your webcam if you don't have to, but I'd like everyone to repeat after me. Raise your hand if need be. This is an official pledge here. So to turn on your mics. Sounds like Nolan is checking in from the freeway. So say if I film
If I film
If I film
I film
with a phone,
with a phone.
I will always hold it sideways.
I will always hold it sideways.
sideways.
This is landscape mode. This is portrait mode. Portrait mode works for TikTok and nothing else. If you're going to film a video, never, ever, 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 ever hold your phone up straight. I know it feels comfortable to do that. It's natural. Hold it sideways. It's totally legit to film with a phone, but I don't want to see any footage like this. Neither does Andrew. So please hold your phone sideways or mount it sideways or whatever you have to do, because once you get to the editing process on Thursday, when we talk about editing, if you go back and look at your footage and realize that you shot stuff in portrait, you will go, oh crap. Because it does not work. I cannot emphasize enough. Please hold your, if nothing else that you learned from this week, learn to hold your phone sideways when you're shooting video. Photos you can hold upright, but video, hold down. So some of the things that we're going to talk about, we're going to briefly take a look at how cameras have evolved over time, some different ways that you can move cameras around, how light affects filming, some different types of cinematic styles, and then Chairman should be joining us right around 3:30 or so. So by the way, that little scene there is from a famous Buster Keaton film. And if you recall, when we were talking to Mary Jane about Charlie Chaplin, I brought up Buster Keaton. He is one of the most remarkable stuntmen of all time. And the stuff that he was doing, like what we were talking about with Gary about how, safety protocols and people have died on set, how Buster didn't kill himself at least 50 times over in films is remarkable. If you just punch in YouTube stunts, Buster Keaton sometime, you will be amazed, because the things that he was doing in 1910 and 1920, they're not even figuring out how to replicate these days with the biggest of action films. And he was doing it in real time, no special effects. So a quick look at just how cameras have evolved over time. Cameras actually have been around for years, but it's how we define what a camera is. In school, we probably all at some point have made a shoebox camera, where you poke a little hole in one end and you let the light come in, and then you try to draw on the other end how the light is refracting. That concept has been around literally for 1,000 years, and it's slowly evolved over time, but it wasn't until 1826 that the modern concept of how to take a photograph was developed. It was developed in France. And then it really came into its own during the American Civil War. Photography really took hold. At that time, it was done on glass. So they would take glass plates. And when you think of the old timey cameras that have like the giant accordion where someone gets in like underneath a cape and then there's a giant flash, they're swapping out glass panes on there and then chemically treating those glass panes. And so they would have to let a ton of light in, and everyone would have to stay still for upwards of a minute in order to get enough sufficient light on that glass to capture that image. Otherwise, the images would come out blurry. Now, after the war, there'd been so many photos taken during the war that were capturing the war. And as soon as the war was over, just everyone just wanted to ignore it and just move on and not even think about it. And so they took all of these glass panes, and a lot of glass houses were made out of Civil War era photographs. So when you think of the old adage, I forget the exact word, but something like "don't throw stones in glass houses" or something. A lot of those post-Civil War 1860s, 1870s glass houses that people were growing food in were quite literally made out of photographs. As things progressed, cameras really didn't become a common thing that people could own until around World War II era. And that's when they came out with these. This is a World War II era Brownie camera. And you would actually crank it on the side to turn the film here. And there's a little viewer up top and to look through. So again, kind of the camera obscura thing, almost like the little shoe boxes that we would use in school. Those evolved over time, and I realize this is a little show and tell, but I'd wish that we could do this in person. This is another evolution of what would be the Brownies. And you'd have this gigantic flash bulb that would come with it. If you're a fan of old films, you'd notice the old flashes, and the bulb would pop out, and you'd actually replace the bulb with each shot. So the bulb would shatter with each photo. And so those old films where you see those giant pops going off, that's because the bulbs, you would be sitting there not just with a roll of film, but a pocket full of bulbs, and every single photographer or newspaper or whatever would have to swap out a new bulb for each photo that they'd take. And then taking the photo is just turning the dial on the side. Cameras started to evolve. Polaroid was a huge advancement when they came out with this monstrosity. This is the early Polaroid cameras, and what Polaroid came along and did before, initially it was glass panes, going back to the 19th century, and then they developed actual film, and Polaroid developed a method for instant chemical treatment. So as the lens captured an image onto film, it would instantly print. And for the younger folks, you'll have no idea what we're talking about, but for some of our older people, you might recall Polaroid cameras, where once you took a photo, it would pop out on the side here. And I actually have a newer version of that right here. This might look a little bit more familiar to you. So this would be a Polaroid style camera. See if I can pop it open. So you take a photo, and instantly, as soon as you took a photo, a little paper thing would pop out of here, and then you'd have to shake it for a minute or two. If you're a fan of the Outkast song, Hey Ya, he says, shake it like a Polaroid picture over and over again. That you'd sit there having to actually shake it out, and that would be the chemicals reacting in the paper to create an image. And after about a minute or two, you'd have a physical photo. Now, cameras started to evolve from there into video cameras specifically. So we would get these monster after Super 8 and 8mm and 16mm. You might have seen these monsters that we put on our shoulders and walk around with all throughout the 80s and 90s. But those started to get a little bit smaller over time, a little bit more compact, into something more like this, where you'd actually get a screen on the back. And then we started to develop into smaller pocket cameras. Some of you probably had something like this, maybe in the past decade or so, while the video cameras that were going digital were more along the lines of this. This would have been something to film like maybe a music video in the 1980s. And now we take all of that and we crunch it down into where we have something like this. a GoPro. This thing takes 4K cinema quality picture and it'll fit in the palm of your hand. It's pretty incredible the way that the technology is advanced. And this same technology is readily available in your phones. So whether you're using a camera or a phone, today we're going to talk about how to really bring out that cinematic quality. Now, the super high-end stuff, just for reference, the way things have evolved is into something like this. This is called a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema. This is a camera that I don't have a lens attached to it right now, but attach the lens, and the Blackmagic Pocket will take major motion picture quality footage with this. So the technology is advanced to where before cost was inhibitive. If you wanted to have something that looked good on the silver screen, you had to spend a lot of money for a massive camera, $20,000, $30,000. This camera, you can get accessories for about $2,000. So it's no longer cost prohibitive making films. And honestly, using this, if people bought this, but they didn't know how to properly light it and how to properly use it, you could get just as good footage from your phone of someone who knows how to light, someone who knows how to properly do all the settings on their phone can get just as good as what you're going to get out of something like this. So don't feel like you have to get a super nice camera in order to make a film. You can do it with your cell phone right now, which is really the beauty, that the fact that the cameras in this have advanced so far that this and a GoPro equate what were massive cameras in the past. So most people, when they get a camera, it'll have a little dial on top and they flip through and they'll leave it on the little green one that just says auto, and that's totally fine. It is okay to shoot in auto mode. What auto mode does is it sets the best possible balance of what some of the things we're going to talk about today: aperture, ISO, shutter speed, white balance. It tries to find the best average setting based on the amount of light. So if you're outside versus if you're inside, if it's a cloudy day, if it's a sunny day, if you're shooting at night, the auto mode by default is going to try to find the right balance in what we call the triangle. And we'll touch on the triangle a little bit later. But as you start to develop your skills, some of those button settings can bring out some pretty remarkable stuff. Now, right now, my camera's acting a little wonky on me, so I'm having to use my webcam on my laptop. But in our earlier session, I was using my Canon M50, which had on it a soft focal lens. So you may have noticed that some of the lights behind me kind of blurred a little bit. They were doing an effect called bokeh, B-O-K-E-H, where the person immediately in front is in focus, but behind, everything goes a little bit out of focus, or it's a little soft. And we'll delve into this, but if you've noticed watching TV shows or movies, sometimes something is in focus and everything behind them is just a big blur. That's a soft focus lens that has a low F rating or a low aperture rating. So there's all sorts of different elements, and we don't need to go through every single one of these shooting modes that you can see on screen, but I just wanted to give you an idea that each one of those dials provides something different for the kind of setting that you're filming. If you're filming something that has very high speed, like Joni, you wanted to film on a bike, you might want to film in sports mode, which goes into a higher ISO setting, which allows to capture more things at a faster speed or a higher frame rate. If you're going to try to shoot any sort of slow motion, these different elements come into play. So you don't have to memorize these. You don't have to even go through them. If you just want to shoot in auto mode, you can shoot in auto mode. You've got enough stuff to worry about with everything we've thrown your way so far. But there's a lot of cool things that you can do when you get off of auto mode and get into manual focus and get into aperture priority and shutter priority. There's all sorts of different cool things that you can do. If at any point, I didn't put in any stops in here for questions, so if at any point someone has a question or wants me to repeat something or slow down or clarify it, by all means, flip your mic on and chime in, okay? So I threw out some terms a minute ago, like ISO, aperture, f-stop, and shutter speed. So that's, they form the triangle of trying to get great cinema quality picture. So ISO stands for International Organization of Standardization. It doesn't mean isolation like everyone thinks. It's International Organization of Standardization. The first question is, why is it ISO when it's iOS as the acronym? I have no idea. It's just always been called ISO or ISO. And what that does, it is a numerical measure of the sensitivity of your lens. Your cell phone has ISO settings. Now, almost everyone here, I'm sure, has taken selfie shots with their phone or taken video with their phone, and all you do is it defaults to the auto mode, and you just press record or you press capture, and that's it. And cool, maybe the photo comes out great. If not, well, put it up on Instagram, and there's all these After Effects filters that you can throw on to get the kind of image that you want. But you may not have even realized that your phone also has manual shooting modes. And your phone can do everything that that Blackmagic can as far as setting your ISO, setting your aperture, setting your shutter speeds, setting frame rates. So the confusing one of all three of these is your aperture. You may have heard the term f-stop before. F-stop is exactly the same thing as aperture. It's an interchangeable term. Some people say aperture, some people say f-stop. What that is, think of the iris in your eye. So like if you've been indoors and all of a sudden, if all of us suddenly stepped outside right now and it's a sunny day, your eye would go boop, or it would retract based on when you were inside or outside to make sure that the light that you're getting in your eye, you don't want to be frying your retina. So it's going to automatically adjust that iris in your pupil to get the proper amount of light coming into your eye. A camera lens functions the exact same way that an eyeball does. So that aperture, that f-stop, is that iris in your eye or in the camera lens opening or closing to adjust to the amount of light. And you can adjust that to change how much light that you're taking in. The more light that you get, the brighter it's going to be in reverse. Now, what gets confusing about aperture and f-stop, different lenses come in with an F number. Like the soft focus lens that I was using on my Canon for our morning session to get that soft effect behind me and all what I used all day Monday, that's a low f-stop lens. It's rated as a 1.4. And what that means is that the lower the f-stop number, the more light it's going to let in. And that seems kind of opposite, but you get a high f-stop number and it's going to let in everything. You get a low f-stop number and you reduce the focus point, but you're letting in more light. And it'll make sense with the graphic that I show in a second here. But just think lower f-stop gives you that soft focus area. Higher f-stop puts everything in focus. So right now with my webcam, you can see all of the CDs and everything that are back behind me, some of my posters. That's because it's at a high focal point. It's a high f-stop by default, webcams, where they put everything in focus. A camera lens you can adjust to put in low f-stop, which will reduce the focal point to just focusing on one thing. Is everyone with me so far? Since we don't have cameras, I'm not sure if I'm having people go cross-eyed right now or not.
Got it.
Okay. The next thing to keep in mind is shutter speed. And the standard rule of thumb is that whatever frame rate you're shooting at, you double it for your shutter speed. Shutter speed is going to determine how much blur there is in a shot. And people think that blur is a bad thing. Blur is not a bad thing. If you use it right, it can actually be a really good thing. If it's used wrong, you start doing this. In fact, everyone start waving your hand in front of your face, and you'll start to notice that your fingers kind of blur. Your eyes work at a certain frame rate. And if there's a motion in front of you that's going too fast, you're going to see some blur. But you can use that blur to an effect by lowering or raising that shutter speed, or the rate at which your eye or your lens or your eye is tracking the movement can determine how much of that blur you're going to see. So balancing the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed are the three big tools that we use to try to find that right look and feel for the picture that we're going to get. So getting into ISO, sensitivity to light. If you take a look at some of these images, the lower the ISO, the darker the image. So you can adjust your brightness in your image simply by adjusting your ISO. However, that comes at a cost. when you're letting in more light, you're also going to change the picture quality. Now, typically when you're filming things or photographing things that are in really high speed, like say you're photographing sports back in the day when we actually still had sports that you could go to and watch. So you go to a local high school football game and it's a little bit darker. It's starting to be around twilight. So there's already light concerns for your camera. And you're trying to take photo of your kids or a buddy who's playing in this high school football game. And you may take 300 photos with your phone or your camera, and maybe 5 of them come out where they aren't blurry. And when they do come out clean, there may not be any blur, but the image comes out kind of grainy, like there's sort of a noise on it. And what's happening is your camera auto-adjusted for the low light setting by increasing the ISO. So it bumped the ISO up to make the image brighter, but in doing so, you get what's called noise. So if you look at that image on the far right there, so the skyscraper on the left side has a very low ISO rating, and so it's not letting in a lot of light. It doesn't have a lot of sensitivity to light, but it's a very clean image. The more you crank that ISO, the more you're going to get of a cleaner shot if there's a lot of action going on, and you're letting in more light. But letting in more light can also have a counter effect if you're going to get a lot of grain in there, and the image isn't going to be as sharp. Now, sometimes you actually want to use that, but it kind of depends on what kind of visual you're trying to get. So f-stop, again, think about your eyeball as being a camera lens. So the focal length is really the f-stop and the f number. So the lower the number, lenses around 1 to 2, and it'll say on a lens, oftentimes, it'll have different numbers in here that'll have the indication of the distance of the lens and the focal point, and then it'll say something like f1.4 or f3.5, and that's what we're measuring with the f-stop rating. So this one right here is a 70 millimeter to 220 millimeter lens rated as f3.5 for this lens. So that means that you're not going to get that super soft look. Like if you look at the stapler on the far right of our image, that is a super soft focal lens rated as 1.4, to where the stapler is in focus, but everything behind the stapler looks a little off focus. And that can be a really beautiful effect when it's done right. F22 is pretty typical of what our webcams are doing, where everything that we're looking at is in focus. Now you can get a sense of this without even having a lens in front of you. Everyone put a finger up. Now stare really hard at your finger. And while you stare hard at your finger, use your peripheral vision to look at the background. Everything around you can see, but it's a little out of focus compared to your finger being very in focus. Your eyeball just went to a soft focus lens. Everyone with me? Oh, hopefully, no, if you're high right now, you're going, whoa, check out my hand. but your eyeball is able to adjust between a soft focus lens to a hard lens. And what we do by changing lenses or by changing our f-stop is also adjust the light that we're letting in, that sensitivity, to go from a soft or hard lens. Does anyone have any questions on that, or can I move on to the next part? Okay, looks like no questions. Oh, sorry, Jenny and Nick, go ahead.
No questions, just going to let you know we're okay.
Okay, I keep feeling, not hearing anything is kind of weird. Not seeing or hearing anyone means I'm not sure on if I'm bombing or if I'm doing great up here. So bear with me. So a little bit more on aperture and f-stop. Wide aperture and small aperture are the terms, or again, a high f number or a small f number. And it seems like it should be opposite, because you would think a higher number means more and a lower number means less, but it's actually opposite. So that lower number is going to be a really wide aperture, to where you're letting in as much light as possible. So if you look at the picture up there to the far left, f2.8, that that eyeball iris is really wide open right now. You're letting in a lot of light. That's a wide aperture. But if you look at the graphic of the camera, you can see, if you look at the camera on the right, that gray area that says in focus, it's only a little bit of area that is actually in focus. Everything else is going to be out of focus. And that's where you get that soft effect, where like with the stapler, the stapler is in that gray area of in focus, and behind it is out of focus. Now, the higher you go up, like an f/22, everyone's webcam is a little teeny tiny dot of a camera lens, right? If you're using a laptop or a desktop that has a built-in webcam, it's a little teeny tiny dot. And that is the f/22 style lens that you see on the far right there. And what it takes is the camera on the left, where that gray area that's in focus is much larger. Now, if I do this, my hand's going to start to go out of focus a little bit. If I go back here, no matter how I move my hand, now it's still in focus. If I get really close, though, it's going to start to get into the out of focus area. So all the way back here, because it's a high aperture, high f-stop, my hand's going to stay in focus. Now, if I was using my Canon M50, that in focus area, like I would be in focus, and like here to here would be in focus, and then everything behind me would be out of focus. Everyone okay with that? Yes? So I mentioned shutter speed, and we don't need to delve into shutter speed too much. Just know that every camera has these settings. Every camera, unless it's a very basic point and click, is going to have shutter speed. It's going to have ISO. It's going to have f-stop, and you've probably never touched them before. But going forward, hopefully now you will, because there's all sorts of cool things that you can do. Even if you're an Instagrammer, this is going to change your Instagram. If you love making photos to put up on Instagram, this is going to totally change the way that you use that site. So the faster the shutter, the smaller the blur. Faster shutter, less blur. Basically, think back to those old accordion style Civil War cameras. They'd have to expose it for like a minute. So if anyone moved slightly, there'd be blur because they're having to let in so much light, and the shutter speed is so low. Basically, that would be a 1 speed. So if you look down there of our image of a person walking, shutter speed at 500, you're not going to have any blur whatsoever. That hand movement goes away. You're going to see your fingers going no matter how fast your hand is going at 500. The more you slow it down, the more you're going to pick up some of that blur, but that blur is actually a good thing. So the standard protocol is that whatever your frame rate is, and we're going to talk about frame rate in just a second, you double that, and that is your standard shutter speed. Now you can adjust your shutter speed as need be if you're intentionally trying to create more blur or intentionally trying to create less blur. But the idea is that typically your shutter speed is going to be double of whatever frame rate it is. So frame rate. Think of film exactly the same way as you think of a photo. When you take a photograph, you are capturing over the course of that little blip of the lens opens, captures light, and closes again. That is the photo that you just captured, and that is a captured moment in time. Film is nothing more than a series of photographs lined up in very close proximity, taking photos very rapidly and then put together in a row to make it look like there's motion. But essentially every piece of film is stop motion in animation. So you think of stop motion like Wallace and Gromit or Gumby, stuff like that. But essentially every piece of film is just a series of photographs lined up in a row to present motion. Now, how many photographs you line up changes how you see it. When you go to a movie theater, movies almost always show in 24 frames per second. So for every 1 second of film that you see on screen, there are 24 photos that are running in sequence. That 24 frames per second is typically how films are shot. And I would encourage that when you go out and shoot your films, that you intentionally try to shoot in 24 frames per second if your camera has frame rate settings available. It gives a very glossy look. If you've ever watched something on TV, like you go to a movie in the theater and it has a really distinct look on the big screen. And then maybe a couple months later, that film comes on HBO and you watch it again at home. And even though it's the same film that you're watching, the picture looks a little bit different. The cinema picture has that added blur because it is a slower version. Now, I'm sure everyone, when you watch TV sometimes and a movie comes on, you will see a little disclaimer that comes on that says, this film has been modified to fit this picture. Well, part of that is that the 24 frames also allows more of a wider range, but also it has a slightly different speed. So TVs normally run at 29.97 frames per second, or just round up 30 frames per second. High definition TVs now up the ante and they run 60 frames per second. So if you watch TV on an older TV, like an old CRT, and then you watch the same thing on a high def TV, or you watch a movie at the movie theater and then you see it on a DVD, it's the same thing, but it looks different. A really distinct way to tell this, if anyone has watched soap operas, soap opera cameras have a really distinct look where everything has really hard surfaces compared to everything else. Soap operas are always shot in 60 frames per second. So you get more of the high def look, but you don't have that softer tone, that softer feel, that added slight blur that you get with 24 frames per second. So it's really your choice. You can shoot in 60 frames per second on your camera. Typically, most cell phone cameras will auto default to 60 frames per second, but you can adjust a lot of them to change it to 24 frames per second. Or you can shoot at 30 frames per second. When we do webcams like what I'm using right now and no one else is actively using, they shoot at 30 frames per second. So where this can become a problem is in the editing process. And I won't touch on editing too much, but just think about if something runs at a slightly different speed than everything else, and we're talking about just a little slight difference, it can look really bad if you try to take a 24 frame video that you shot and then bump it up to 60 frames per second. Or if you're trying to do slow motion and you shoot it in 24 frames per second, and now slow motion, basically you're reducing that by half, 12 frames per second, it's going to be jerky. It's going to look like you're doing the robot dance if you're trying to slow down a 24 frame per second shot. But if you do it in 60 frames per second, it's still going to look okay. It's going to look kind of like a TV does. But if you bump it up to 120 frames per second and then you slow it down to half speed, that's when you get those really cool slow motion shots that people use in a lot of web videos and stuff, or TV commercials. I can't see you, but everyone nod your head. Yes, Kurt, we know what you're talking about. When there's kind of those half speed shots, they intentionally set their cameras to 120 frames per second, and then they slow it down to half speed. So they're essentially adjusting it to the HD speed of 60 frames per second, but the original shot is 120. So you're adjusting the speed. If anyone loves old silent films, or if you've seen really old, like World War I war footage, stuff like that, Mary Jane, I know, is a fan of Charlie Chaplin's. So those cameras back in the day, they hand cranked. So you can think of like a big giant wooden box with a lens on it, and they'd be sitting there doing this, and they're physically running the film past the lens. Now, the idea was that the good cameraman would always crank at the same consistent speed. But sometimes if you watch really, really old film from like World War I or pre, you might notice that it looks like everyone's walking super fast, or then it would slow down and speed up and slow down again. That's because the person cranking the camera wasn't totally consistent with the speed that they were moving the film. They were manually moving it through. So when people go back to try to restore super old footage, what they do is they try to find a common frame rate. So if there's different shots being spliced together, maybe someone was cranking it at the equivalent of 11 frames per second, then the next shot they did, they cranked it just slightly faster because we're human and we make mistakes like that. Maybe they were doing 16. They try to find a happy balance to find that, to find a common ground frame per second. And so the result is that you see people suddenly, it looks like a century ago, everyone walked much faster than they do now. The other thing to set with a camera is
Wait, I have
white.
a question.
Yes, go ahead, Hannah.
Question about the frames per second for specific for the phone. Like,
Right.
what do you think we should be doing? What should we be doing on an iPhone? Should we do the TV one or the 24?
I will be getting to that shortly. So bear with me, and I took some screen grabs of my phone so that we can follow along with that specifically. Okay.
Okay.
So what white balance does is it determines a solid color palette. So like this is the kind of thing that photographers and videographers carry around, and it's just a color sheet. It's just a piece of paper that has standardized colors on it. But what we do is we snap a photo of this first, and then we set this as the color scheme inside our camera. So it knows, okay, so green is going to match that green, or this darker green is going to match that. And it all starts with the white. So there is a setting in every camera that says white balance. And normally these auto, and it's totally fine to put it on auto, but there's a flaw with the auto. And that is that if the light changes, your colors will suddenly change too. So if, say, you're filming indoors and you have like a glass door and you're going to film yourself like taking a selfie shot walking through the glass door, and your camera, when you start recording, is taking in a certain amount of light for the indoor setting, and suddenly you walk outside and it's a bright sunny day, your camera is going to go haywire. All of a sudden it's going to go super dark, and then it's almost going to kind of like pulse with different colors slowly coming in and out, because it's trying to find that new balance, that auto setting, because you just changed the lighting on it. And that's a real flaw that white balance has. So I personally never shoot with auto white balance. The first thing I do when I turn on my camera is I go to the white balance setting, and they have built-in settings for outdoors or indoors or in the shade. Tungsten lighting, which if you look at the presets on the far right there, tungsten is more like those bluish lights, like the light bulbs have different colors. And so, in fact, I can show you with my key light, and I'll mention what a key light is soon. So I have a key light here, and I'm going to adjust the kelvins. And it's a little subtle, but if you look at my face, here is a tungsten blue, here is a fluorescent orange, and there's a standard white. So you can see how that is changing the skin tones on my face as I cycle through them. Really, that's what you're doing with white balance, is determining this is the color white, and everything else on the color palette is going to be based off of that initial white color. So it's a good idea to go in and set a white balance first based on the setting that you're shooting in. If it's indoors, are you under like those bluish tone lights, or are you under more of a warm light? Well, set it tungsten or set it fluorescent. You can also customize these, and that custom button is where I physically take a photo of this and I save it in my camera. And then when I turn my camera on, I go straight to the custom setting and I set that color tone. Now, you don't have to have one of these. All you need to do is grab a piece of printer paper. Grab a piece of paper off a printer or just a white piece of paper and take a photo of it with your camera and save that just white, that all white in your camera. And then if you can set custom, set that when you turn your camera on. And now all of your colors should balance out based on that white setting. Everyone good with white balance? So here's that triangle that I was talking about. The balance between finding the right aperture, the right shutter speed, and the right ISO. If you can get in the middle of the triangle, you are golden. And this is what separates the amateur auto photographers from the professionals who can get paid for doing this kind of work, or the cinematographers that make a very good living getting the perfect kind of color scheme. It all comes down to balancing aperture, shutter speed, and ISO in the middle, and then finding the frame rate and the shutter speed. Now the frame rate, most films, they're going to shoot them in 24, so you know that the shutter speed is going to be 48. But so after your 24 and 48, or if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, well, your shutter speed is going to be 120. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, though, are going to modify the look and feel of that either 24 frames or 60 frames shot that you're going to get. So you can balance this before you ever press record, of adjusting your ISO dial. If you want a little bit of a darker look, turn it down a little bit. If you want a brighter look, turn your ISO up. Adjust your aperture or your f-stop if you want that kind of that blurred look from behind, but your your subject being in focus. And again, shutter speed for higher exposure or for lower exposure. Does the triangle make sense? I will tell you, this does not need to be memorized. I carry around a triangle cheat sheet in my camera bag. Most photographers, most videographers, most cinematographers, they carry around a little diagram card that they'll laminate, keep in their pocket as a cheat sheet of, with this aperture and this ISO, I should have this shutter speed to get into the sweet spot in that exposure triangle. Everybody with me still? Let me know if I'm going too fast. So Hannah, here's where we're going to get into what you were asking about. So these are some quick screen grabs that I took from my phone this morning. So if everyone is filming with their phone, typically on an iPhone, or I have an Android, but turn on the camera and it's going to default just to, do you want to take a photo or do you want to take a video? Well, that's the bottom one there. And I realize iPhone is a little bit different. So sorry for iPhone users, we're going to go through the Android version here, but they should be essentially the same. So if you're using photo or video, in the case of Android, if you scroll through the options, there's a little button there that says more. And you've probably never even gone to more. But more is where you start to separate yourself from anyone who's just going to pick up a camera and shoot. So once I go to more, I get these settings of pro, panorama, food, night, live focus, selective focus, wide selfie, sports, pro video, super slow-mo, slow motion, and hyperlapse. So selective focus is your f-stop rating. Pro up there is for photos, but I'm going to click on pro video. So when I touch pro video, I get that third screen. And now you should start to know what these settings are. ISO is the one on the left, and I can manually adjust my ISO. There's a little scroll bar. When I bring my ISO down, my picture gets darker. Bring up my ISO up, and it gets brighter. Or I have a little button that says auto, and it will auto set my ISO for the kind of light that my lens is currently picking up right now. The next button I have, and you can see it on screen there, it says f1.5 and a1/60, or I guess it says a1/30. So these are your shutter speeds and your aperture on the same thing. Now, my camera is combining the two. So it instead, for Android, it decided rather than leave your aperture and your shutter speed as totally separate things, it's taking part of the guesswork out of it for you, where it's combining the two into one. So if I want to drop way down low, I'm getting kind of that softer look, and picking selective focus is going to give it even more of an option. I also have an F button that I can push at the bottom. It swaps between f1.5 and f2.4. Next is my standard button where I can adjust temperatures, tint, contrast, and these will change your color, and you can just kind of mess around with them a little bit to get a sense of how vibrant and saturated you want your colors to be, or how grayish and dull you want them to be, how dark and light you want them to be. But you can mess with these various settings of highlights, saturation, contrast, tint, temperature, also things that you can do in the editing process too. There's an old saying, we'll fix it in post, and it's an old editing joke that survives, and that comes out of color adjustments, and we'll talk about that stuff more on Thursday. But you don't just have to go by whatever your camera by default is seeing color-wise. You can adjust things tremendously by just going into these pro settings. And then of course here also is my white balance. Now, when I touch my white balance, it's giving me a number in the thousands with a K. That is kelvins, Kelvin rating. So light bulbs are measured based on temperature. And it's not temperature like it's 85 degrees outside, but it's measured in kelvins as far as the color goes. So depending on the temperature rating is going to be the kind of color that you give off. So my key light here, when I go to a higher light on my key light and I adjust to a bluish tone, that is a different temperature from the warm tone. Now, if you've ever gone into, say, an office building and you've noticed that they have like that fluorescent track lighting along the top with the plastic covers, and everything has kind of a bluish hue to it. I always feel like that blue is just like sucking the life energy out of me. Those rooms always bother me, but sometimes you walk into a room and the lighting feels white. Sometimes you walk into a room and it has kind of a bluish tone. Sometimes you walk into a room and it has more of an orangish tone. That is the Kelvin temperature of that light bulb. And if you ever look at a light bulb, it'll say right on there exactly what the Kelvin temperature is, measured in thousands. So it can go up to like 23 or 30,000 down to just a couple thousand. And depending on that color spectrum is where you're going to see that bluish tone or that warmer orangish tone. Hannah, did that answer your question, or do you want me to delve into that a little bit further?
The iPhone doesn't seem to have this same kind of control.
Okay.
But it does give options for the speed at which you're recording. So it says that it can go to that 24 FPS setting for.
Great.
And yeah, I'm wondering if I should set it at that or if I should leave it at the default, which is the one that corresponds to the TV and internet.
It depends on if you're going to be filming anything for slow motion. Like if you're looking on the Android settings, it has a default slow motion and super slow motion. Those are the two in the very bottom and bottom left. That's by default setting the frame rate. So the slow motion would be 120 frames. And then it's going to slow it down to 60 frames in the shot. The super slow-mo is going to be somewhere more in the neighborhood of 300 to 400 frames. And that's where you get the shots of like when someone opens up a can of soda and you see like the spray in a TV commercial. They're doing that super slow-mo with hundreds of frames per second so that they can slow it down back to real time. And you get that slow or like a cloud of dust thing. If you've ever seen footage of someone popping a balloon and it slowly does that, that's the super slow-mo. Android versus iPhone, if it has a frames per second setting, great, use it. If not, go by these default Pro Video or Pro Camera settings to try to get the effect and look that you want.
Where did you find the frames per second setting on the iPhone, Hannah?
So I just went into settings and then the camera app in settings.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then it has a record video button, and then it shows you a list of different ones to choose.
If you're using a phone, explore the settings before you start hitting record or photo. You'd be surprised how many adjustments you can make, and you've probably never even delved into that because everyone, if they're going to be somewhere, they just want to take a quick selfie. Okay, camera on and press the button, and that's all they do, right? But going into the settings, there's all sorts of fun things that phone cameras will do, and that's why the phone cameras have advanced so far that people now are making movies with just their phones. Sometimes it's kind of a dare just to see, like, is it technologically possible from a logistics standpoint? And others are like, you know what, the iPhone takes fantastic video. As long as you're setting your shutter speeds and your ISO and your frame rate and you know how to balance those out to get the right exposure triangle, you can get incredible footage. In fact, Apple has been promoting that. In the last couple of months, I've been seeing TV commercials that Apple is promoting their newest iPhone, and it specifically says shot with iPhone 10, and it looks like a movie, right? I'm sure some of you probably know. I think there was one with like a big snowball fight that they were doing around Christmas time, promoting the newest iPhone, and they were saying shot with iPhone, but they were adjusting the ISO, the shutter speed, the frame rates, and all that to try to get the real cinematic look that they were looking for. So mess around with your settings on your phone. Maybe spend some time this afternoon snapping some things around your house, or go outside and try taking some photos outside versus inside, and adjust those settings, adjust the saturation, adjust different things to see the kind of look and feel that you want to get. So it's not just about adjusting those settings, but it's also about how you move the camera around. Now, some people may have selfie sticks that they put their camera on and do this with. You can get great shots with a camera. I'm sure everyone has used Zoom before on a camera, zooming in and out, or with your phone doing this to zoom in. But you can also physically move the camera, and camera movement is also a big part of it. Camera movement brings life to the footage. It makes the audience feel like they're a part of what they're experiencing. And there's different ways that you can do that. There's basic movements though, so I'll use I'll use my phone just as an example. So if my phone was my camera, a dolly would be focusing in on whatever I'm looking at and physically moving the camera in or physically moving the camera out. This would be a dolly movement. A boom is, say I had this on my tripod, which I had a tripod around here somewhere, and I was lifting it up or down. A jib or a boom is this physical movement. So like if, and it doesn't have to be on a tripod to do this. Say like you have a shot of someone who is laying down and you want the camera to track with them as suddenly they get up and they stand up. Well, you could start with the camera low and you're going to boom it up as they start to stand up. You're going to follow their movement with them so that the camera stays focused on their face as they move up and down. There's, in fact, I will grab my truck. The term truck is a Charlie Chaplin term, Mary Jane. This is something that Chaplin invented. So from the early days of filming, they were trying to figure out how to provide more movement in camera, because the early day films, the camera just sat still. Maybe it sat on a tripod and moved, but they wanted to give some life to the movement. So they came up with the idea of a truck, and the truck was literally a truck. Let's put the camera on a truck and drive in front of, I don't know, someone on a horse. Or let's follow along as a train goes down the tracks. And that way the camera, if this is our camera, and this is called a truck slider. So it has a little, all it is a bar I can put on a tripod, and this thing slides back and forth. But I can mount my camera on there, and then the camera can stay focused as I physically move the camera left and right. It allows me to essentially do this with the camera on a tripod. So that's a truck. And that came from the early black and white silent film days of them wanting to figure out how can we get movement, and they physically put a camera on the flatbed of a truck. Now, sliders like that, you'll see all kinds of different variations. Then pan. There's actually kind of an insider joke on this slide, because you'll notice at the bottom there it says, everything says pan. Well, that's because everyone knows the term pan, but panning is a very specific term. Most of these are not pans, but panning would be like, okay, here's my camera, here's my lens, and I'm going to turn it like this. So Z-axis, everyone remember from math class, X-axis, Y-axis, Z-axis, when trying to do geometry or whatever class that was. So panning is this. So you've got your physical axis and you're moving it back and forth. So on a tripod, so like the bicycle scene that we were talking about with Gary earlier, Joni, when he said if you just want something basic of going to A to B, I would just set my camera up on the sidewalk and have it on a tripod, and I would just pan to follow along as the person rode by. All I would do is pan the camera to show that sense of movement. If you want something much more in depth, maybe do a dolly in. So a dolly in would be like an extreme close. Remember Wayne's World? Extreme close up! Whoa! Whoa! They're dollying in super close and then dollying back the camera. So they're physically moving the camera up to the person's face. The other thing is a tilt axis. So a tripod, typical tripod. Here's my tripod that had the remember yesterday we were talking about tripod holders? Okay, so here's my camera on a tripod. So I can, hang on, there we go. So I can pan left and right. Dolly would be physically moving it forward and back. Tilt would be bringing the camera up and down. And then roll, tripods have roll as well. So if I suddenly wanted to go sideways and back up, you can do some really fun 360 stuff with things like this. This is a Moza Air gimbal. What you do is the camera mounts on this little plate, and then it has these motors to balance to make sure that the camera lens always stays stable. So wherever I may move around, and I can walk around with this. And if you've ever tried to film with just holding your phone or camera, you get this movement, and you're going to give people air sickness or motion sickness if you're walking around too much. Well, with this, I can walk around, and you might see a little bit of movement, but it's not a roller coaster ride. It's rolling hills. It's soft, slight Midwestern rolling hills that you can barely feel. Another way to mount is, of course, over the shoulder mounts. So I could mount my camera on here, and then I could walk around, and I could do pans like this, where essentially I'm making my body the entire camera, and I can mount with it. So roll is simple enough of rolling the camera around like this. If you wanted to give a spinning effect, you could do that. Any questions on camera movement? If not, I'll move on to dollies. There's all sorts of different dollies. I've seen people use skateboards and roller skates to put their camera on. If you're a fan of watching behind the scenes documentaries like I am, if you get the Blu-ray or the DVD and you watch the making of film and you see big things happening on set, and right behind it, it looks like there's something like a railroad track and you're not quite sure what that is. That is a dolly, or that is think of my truck slider, but on a much larger scale, like a railroad track scale. So that middle photo there is an example of a dolly or a truck slider, where they are keeping the camera focused in on specific action, but they are physically moving the camera along a track. Same thing can be done with a car. Excuse me. You can mount a camera onto a car or a truck, and you can physically dolly that camera around. Dolly doesn't have to just be in and out. A dolly can be all sorts of movement, but you're mounting a camera onto a thing and then moving that thing so that the camera goes with it. So a dolly could just as easily be I know I keep going back and referencing the bicycle shot that we talked about, but maybe the camera is mounted onto a second bicycle. And so the subject is the person riding a bike, and the person in front of it is a second bike. Or like Gary talked about, of putting someone in the back of a truck or a hatchback car. Suddenly that car has become the dolly. All sorts of different mounts out there. Here's a little teeny tiny phone tripod. If you buy lens cleaning kits, they'll almost always include these. And then I mounted a little add-on there. Gimbals, like what I just held up, once they're activated, you can see that little GIF there. The camera stays totally stable no matter how much the guy moves around. Whenever possible, I highly recommend mounting your cameras, whether that's on a tripod or something. You can use books, you can use some sort of lean-to, but you want to try to get stable shots whenever possible. Now, earlier in our morning session, I mentioned Lord of the Rings and how they got Elijah Wood to look so small. That is camera perspective. We have a kid here who is even taller than a lighthouse because the camera is put low to the ground, looking up at them with an object off in the distance. You can do all sorts of fun stuff with perspective. If you just have two people stand side by side and then have one person take a couple steps forward, suddenly that one person looks huge and the one that's standing still looks way smaller. It's all about that perspective based on the eye. So you can also adjust perspective based on the angle. So for our lighthouse here, the camera is really low to the ground. Basically, the camera is almost in the grass looking up, and it makes this little kid look gigantic. Well, let's take the example of a hallway in the school. If a camera is at eye level for everyone, you're seeing everything typical eye level. You put the camera on the ground, it gives a totally different look and feel. You're seeing feet and you're seeing people way off in the distance. You put the camera high up, maybe you're hanging from the ceiling or you climbed up onto a bookcase or something. And again, you have a much different look and feel of the exact same setting. The same setting, high school hallway, but up here, here, and here is going to give you a totally different look from your lens and in your footage. Now, that can also come back to bite you sometimes. Usually it's totally on accident, but if you have your camera at just the right angle, you can catch some pretty funny moments, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. Like we have the invisible man playing hockey, or we have a headless gymnast, or a horse rider here. Now, all these people are just being caught in the process of what they're doing, but the lens is at just the right angle to make things disappear or put things in front of the camera to give it a totally different perspective. You can also do really fun stuff with perspective. I have a 360 camera that you can do all sorts of fun stuff with. Look at the far right example. That is an individual putting their camera physically on a railroad track and using the reflection of the railroad track to see their entire character. So the lens is only picking up the feet and like up to about the knees, maybe a little bit higher, but you can see the entire person in that shot through a reflection in the railroad track because of how low the lens is. The basketball shot, they basically have the camera on the ground facing up, so it's a tilt shot with the person looking over them, and you get this monster view of looking straight up and the whole different view of the world. Or someone holding just a water bottle, and then way off in the distance is a waterfall, but it looks like the waterfall is pouring out of this. Any tourist ever who has ever gone to Italy and visited the Leaning Tower of Pisa has done the cliche photo of doing this while the Leaning Tower is in the background to make them look like they're holding it up. One of my favorite viral videos is a guy who goes around and he just high fives everyone who's trying to take a selfie in front of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Anytime someone is trying to do this, make it look like they're holding it up, he just runs up and goes, and everyone just turns around looking like real confused, like what the hell? He just quickly runs off, high five everyone, high five everyone. You can have a lot of fun with perspective, depending on where you put the camera. If you get the right angle, you can get some really cool shots, or you can get a headless gymnast, depending on what you're doing. Okay, everyone grab your lamp or your light. I told everyone to grab a light. This little thing right here is called a lume cube. And a light, you don't need to have really nice high-end lighting. You can do all sorts of things with light. So if everyone could turn on their webcams, if you have a webcam, and we're going to do a couple of experiments. So for example, there's soft light and there's hard light, and we'll delve into that. But lighting can have all sorts of different effects in terms of how you see your subject. You don't have to have really high-end expensive lights. You can use a lamp, you can use a flashlight, you can use like a light like this that has a very variable setting. The battery's dying on this one, but whatever light you have, you can adjust in all sorts of ways by maybe putting a piece of paper over it, or maybe putting a t-shirt over it. There's different kinds of filters. Like my lume cube here has a warm filter that I can put on, and now it's more orange. I can put on additional filters to further diffuse it. Having all, you can have too much light where it drowns stuff out. You can have not enough light where it doesn't fill in. But in our example that we see on screen here, the all lights shot versus the key light shot versus the fill light. Now I have a key light going right now, and I also have fill lights for the setting that I have. If you look at my screen, you can see kind of a bluish, reddish, different lights. I have even a string of lights behind me. All of that gives different lighting effects. So I'll go one by one to show you what a different selective lights have. So I'll turn off my red light here. I'll turn off my blue light, turn off my background bokeh lighting. Here's my key light. And then here, I will switch over to we're going to use my GoPro. So we'll go on a little tour of my setup here. So I had a light that was on my clapper board to light that up. Over here, we have what's called a soft box. And this is essentially, think of like a lamp that would have a t-shirt over it. I have another soft box here, and those are just lighting up the ceiling to give that background effect. Now, when you look at my picture after I turned off all of my background lights, it looked kind of plain. But when I had everything on before, it gave a whole different cinematic look. So here, I'll show you what's inside the soft box. It's just a bulb, but it has reflections to diffuse that hard light so that everything gives a softer feel, a softer vibe. So let me turn some of these back on. There's our string of Christmas lights in the background. And swap back to here and bring on my key light. Notice the difference? Everyone nod your head, yes. So having those subtle lights can have a profound impact in terms of the way that you see your subject. It can be just a little tiny lamp that you have. A desk lamp can work wonders. Having a key light, though, doesn't mean having a light directly in front of you. You don't want to have someone have a light straight on in someone's face, because the result of this, if you put a light directly in front, is that you get shadows on both sides of your face. A key light is more like this. It's going to light up someone's face, but it's going to be slightly off center. You don't want to be blinding whoever you're filming, but you also want to have one side maybe lit slightly more than the other side. Nick, looks like you have a question, but you're muted. Oh, okay, sorry. There's also backlights. Now, I don't have a backlight because this room is kind of small, but normally I would set an additional light behind me that would be out of frame so you couldn't see it, but it would be lighting up behind me as well. So that diagram on the right there, typically you have a 3-point setup. So you can use desk lamps, you can use floor lamps, you can use whatever kind of light you grabbed to give that backlight, that fill light, and that key light effect. Okay, let's delve more into this. Now this is where everyone grab your light. And we're going to see what kind of effect a light has at different angles. So as you were kids, probably everyone did this at some point, trying to tell a scary story. You light up your face and you get that effect. But you get a totally different look if you light above. With your webcam on, or hey, great, yeah, turn on your flashlight in your phone and just move your light to different sides of your face and see how those different angles change the way that you are presented in picture. How you set up your lighting is going to have a huge impact in terms of how your subject is seen on camera. Lighting is what separates the men from the boys here, or the ladies from the girls. I don't want to be discriminatory in any way. Lighting is really where a lot of your color comes out. Now you can adjust color palettes a little later on, but this has such a profound impact. And it's something as simple as just putting a light here and then setting a light down here or setting a light over here just off frame can have a huge impact in the way things are seen. There's also soft light versus hard light. Now, when I grabbed my GoPro, you saw those big giant white boxes, but you can do the exact same thing if you have a desk lamp and you put a t-shirt over it, or you put a piece of paper over it, or you have a colored piece of translucent plastic. If you just have a straight bulb, I took all the filters off of here. This is hard light. You can see there's a lot of shadow going on my face. I put the filters on, give a softer look, it diffuses the light, and now my skin tone lights up more, but I'm not getting all those shadows. Hard light, soft light. Hard light, soft light. So you don't always want to just point a light directly at someone. Sometimes you want to light up a background. Sometimes you want to light up different areas. You'll notice I have two different lights down here. I have a blue and a red that illuminates my background, as well as a whole string of like, not Christmas lights, but a string of lights that also kind of illuminates the background. It provides more ambiance for the background. Hard light inevitably always creates shadows. Soft light really diffuses shadows. So you're playing with light and shadow. Lighting scenes, you can see in this shot, these are more professional lighting setups like the soft boxes that I have, and I have a whole variety of soft boxes. You don't necessarily need soft boxes. Like I said, you can use a desk lamp, you can use a floor lamp, you can use a flashlight, you can use all sorts of light. As long as you're figuring out how to diffuse it, you can create all sorts of coloring effects. So, but that key light is the big one. So key light right here, my key light's off, my key light's on. Do you see the vast difference there in terms of the skin tones, the way that they come out? My key light is not facing me directly head on. It's at a slight angle. So if you look at this diagram, you'll see that the key light is kind of off to the side, and they're using what's called a fill reflector card, or just a reflector. If you're filming outside, you can capture the sun to have this exact same effect as a key light. The way that you can do that is, here's my reflector. So pop this open and find the right angle to get that light coming back, and I'm going to reflect that light back onto my subject's face. You can do the same thing with aluminum foil. Take a big sheet of aluminum foil and maybe glue it to a piece of cardboard, and you've got a reflector. You don't need to have a professional one like this, but that is the exact same thing if you're going to shoot outside in the sun, as having that soft light versus the hard light. I talked already a little bit about temperature, kelvins, get that blue light look. And again, that's with my key light as well. So there's a lower Kelvin for warmer and a higher Kelvin for colder. Warmer, colder. A few thoughts about filming outdoors. You really don't want to film around noon. And the reason why is because you end up with that directly overhead look where all of the shadows in a person's face comes out. So like like Andrew was talking about, as far as filming settings and times to film and being aware of your location, take into account where the sun is located, because the location of the sun is going to have a big impact as far as lighting and illuminating your subject matter. So I'm going to talk about golden hour in just a minute, but always kind of be aware of where the sun is, because it can have very different impact as far as how something looks. Take a look at the woman and the girl in our two examples here. Depending on where they're standing, you get a different look and feel to the image. Backlight means that they're shooting with the sun behind them. And so you get that very soft glow, almost like it's a low aperture lens. Standing in the shade comes across standard, but then that direct sun look, if they're looking directly into the sun, you're seeing more shadow on the individual's face. Also, the girl looks extra grumpy because she's having to stare into the sun if you look at the far left photo. So here's a couple of photos that I took on Friday. I had a meeting over at the Ross Raglan Theater here in Klamath Falls, and I decided I'd snap a photo of the spire outside of the theater. Now, the one on the right, I used a UV filter on the lens because the sun was still poking out right next to the spire. And so essentially, this is like sunglasses for your camera lens. So it does give that more of that purple vibe, but you can see the sun is starting to poke out and it gives it a different look. The photo on the left, I took about a minute later, where I took the UV lens off and then I just took a photo of the spire. And you can see the drastic contrast between having that sun poke through and the sun being visible on the lens versus the sun being hidden in a shadow. Everybody with me? So golden hour. There is a time, and I'm sure we've all thought about it without even realizing that it's called this, but especially in summertime, you feel this. On a nice sunny day, just as the sun starts to go down over the crest, the sun is gone, but the whole sky suddenly lights up, and in the clouds you get these pink colors, and you get all these different colors that just come out super vibrant. That's called golden hour. And there is a time immediately after the sun sets where for about half an hour to 45 minutes, depending on the time of year, the entire sky is illuminated, but there's no shadow. And film crews love this time because colors come out like no other time of day. You get such incredible shots that you can't get any other time of day. So if you're going to be doing some outdoor shots, and if you really want your colors to pop, what you'll want to do is look up what time sunset is tomorrow. Find out the exact minute that the sun sets and be prepared to hit record as soon as the sun sets. And that will give you the golden hour time. And perfect timing. There's our guest. Hey, Chairman. Hello, sir. So we're wrapping up talking about lighting, and then we're going to jump into your portion. So just sit tight for a little bit, okay?
Sure, no problem.
Cool. So unless you have some insight that you want to tell all of our students about golden hour, have you done any filming during golden hour?
I have actually, and I remember that it got much darker than I expected for them to still be able to shoot. It was practically dark by the time the golden hour ended. I thought it would end much earlier.
With film crews, what I would see around LA a lot is that everyone would just be sitting around waiting in the afternoons, doing a whole lot of nothing. And the second the sun sets, there's this mad scramble to shoot as much as they possibly can within that half hour or 45-minute time frame that they have during golden hour before it just goes totally dark. But you get colors during golden hour like you will never see in any other time. When you see the skies turn pink, that's the time to turn on the camera. So there's all kinds of different diffusers, we like the softbox lights that I showed before, using shadows to great effect. Film noir is a genre that Mary Jane probably loves, since she loves old Chaplin and old black and white. And it's really a distinct look. It's a feel. It's taking that black and white look, but with very specific kind of lighting to really emphasize shadows. Look at the lady on the left there. They have a very hard light directly on her face that's really pinpointing. Then they also have a backlight behind her to illuminate her hair, and everything else is going dark, and it's giving a really distinct look, a really distinct vibe. And that's being created simply by where they're locating the lights off camera. All kinds of cinematic styles. Chairman's probably been involved in every single one of these in some form or another, but I just mentioned film noir, which takes on a very black and white vibe, trying to connect to old like 20s, 30s, golden age of Hollywood. That kind of all falls under film noir. Sepia tones give more of that kind of brownish vibe. It gives more kind of an old-timey look. You'll see sepia sometimes in like Westerns. More of a bluish hue is used for a lot of action films. And that film grain that I was talking about earlier in talking about ISO, and that the higher ISO will give you more of a grain in your picture. That's used oftentimes in war films to try to show the grittiness of the action that's going on. And romantic films in turn will bring out more of that lower Kelvin warmish tone in lighting to kind of make colors pop a little bit more. So I'll show you some examples here. My all-time favorite director is a French director named Jean-Pierre Junot. Most of his films in this country aren't very well known, but his best known film was called Amelie. It won I think it won an Academy Award when it came out. But here's some samples of Amelie. And what Jean-Pierre Junot does with his films so well, and Wes Anderson is great at this as well, is making colors more vibrant and more saturated than they actually are in real life. And that draws the eye in more to from the viewer perspective. If something's really popping beyond what it would normally be, distorting those colors or doing a discordant color scheme makes things pop. And anyone who's seen any Wes Anderson film, you know that the colors really go over the top between the Steve Zissou film versus like the Grand Budapest Hotel. The colors vary wildly. So a typical film color palette, here's a shot from The Revenant, very bluish, very high Kelvin tone to give that bluish tone that creates more of a despairing look. Game of Thrones used this a ton when they were filming, especially when they were doing all of their ice scenes up in the north. Whereas in contrast, action films will maybe take on more of what's called a teal and orange, where the orange color brings out all of the color tones, but that teal still brings in that bluish effect. So you get the contrast between the two. So like Mad Max in the bottom left there, the sky really pops with that blue tone, but the orange color brings out the desert really well. So I wanted to welcome our guest. I've known Chairman here for about 20 years. We're old, man. What happened? I've known Chairman from my days when I lived in Hollywood, and he is an Air Force veteran who turned to acting, and he's appeared in many TV shows and films and commercials, and done a lot of stage work.
Depends upon your definition of many as far as on screen, but
Right.
definitely a lot of stage work. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of plays. So Chairman is someone who has survived in the Hollywood scene for many years, and Hollywood has a tendency to chew people up and spit them out. So kudos to this gentleman for finding a career in it. I wanted to bring in Chairman today because we have talked yesterday and today a lot about screenplays. We've talked about formulating your shots. We've talked about lighting. We've talked about cinematography. What we haven't talked about is being on camera. And Chairman, to give you an idea, everyone here is making a film. They have 1 week to make a short film, 5 minutes or less. Minimal dialogue. We're trying to push more towards visual storytelling rather than a lot of talking to get bogged down in that. Because most of our students here are going to be using their phones to film, and so it's a 1 week whirlwind of a project where everyone has just been inundated, and their heads are probably their brains have gone through a blender at this point with all the information we've thrown their way as far as writing for screenplay, shoot locations, planning your shots, lighting, cinematography. And I was hoping that you could provide some insight to bring it all together about the one thing that we haven't talked about, and that's really like, what's it like to be on camera, and what are some do's and don'ts about that? And I wanted to open up to questions as well, because I want to make sure that in all of the rush to try to film something that we don't forget, oh yeah, I'm actually going to be on camera. What do I do on camera? Number one rule, like, don't look directly into the lens unless you're actually narrating the scene. Little things like that. But could you give us a little bit more as far as your background and some of your work, and then delve into some tips and advice for people of being on camera?
Yeah, sure. I came to LA. I actually, during the Air Force, my career in the Air Force, I worked in radio and television. I was a radio DJ in Korea for a year. I did a lot of training videos and stuff at the Air Force Academy for 3 years when I first got out of tech school. So my background is in production, and then I've also, been in acting since I was like a kid. So. When I first got to LA, I went to a place called Film Industry Workshops, which sadly is no longer around. And they actually specialized in teaching acting for the camera. And I learned a hell of a lot there from the teachers. And one of the keys to acting in front of the camera is to basically to have an awareness of the camera, but also to ignore it. You need to know where the camera is. You need to be able to cheat towards it. But at the same time, it should just be a wall. You should just not even, you have to just kind of be aware of it without being aware of it. Michael Caine has a book out that has a lot of really cool technical tips in, like, if you're in a scene and I have a scene partner over here, I should be looking at them with this eye so that my face cheats out towards the camera. That's clear. So if I'm in a direct profile scene, there's another person sitting here, I want to look at them with this eye, and they should look at me with their eye that's away from the camera, so that we're both kind of cheated out toward the camera, and it gives the camera a more interesting look than if it's like just straight on profile, unless that's exactly what you're going for. So, there's lots of little technical cheats like that that are great in Michael Caine's book. Yeah, but also, you're finding marks. You have to have marks, especially if you're working with different lenses that have short focal lengths. You want to hit that mark. If you're not able to, because you've got your camera operators there have measured that out so that they can roll that focus in for that mark. So you need to be able to hit your mark without having to look like you're hitting a mark. Stuff like that. And it's like, it's hard for me to really think of them all right now, just kind of off the top of my head, but it's a lot of little things like that.
What are some of the nuances as far as looking natural on camera? Because when you're in the course of trying to film something, especially with all of the information that we've been inundated all of these fine folks with, they're thinking about f-stop rating and shutter speed and frame rate and all that, and you can get kind of robotic and caught up in all of that, not thinking like, oh, right now I need to be, thinking about gardening and being natural. So how do you go through all of that kind of pre-production stuff? Because I'm sure you've probably done some independent projects or filmed some stuff on your own a little bit too, where you go through all of that pre-production stuff of, I got to think of this, this, and this, and then you flip that switch and go, okay, it's time to press record, and now I'm just going to be in the moment of what it is that I'm trying to film.
Yeah. A phrase that a friend of mine, Richard Horvitz, likes to use. Richard might be familiar to people as Invader Zim from the cartoons, or Alan from the movie Summer School. He has a phrase called playing pretend. We don't act, we go out there and we try to play pretend, and it becomes more of a game that way. So it's okay. So now I'm working, I'm doing all the technical stuff, I'm doing all of that stuff, I'm getting ready. Now it's time to play. And that's kind of the trick that we use. It's like, okay, let's go play. Let's play pretend. Now I'm the guy in the garden digging the weeds out.
Fantastic. Does anyone have any questions for Chairman? Or we could talk about maybe some of our projects as far as development of our scripts go, and he may have some advice for perhaps how to film them. We have one that I've been referencing that Joni and Hannah have been working on that's going to involve a bicycle in some way. So some of the logistics as far as filming with a bicycle. Another one is we've been talking about possibly being set in a family restaurant. And that comes with its own sort of issues as far as background noise and clanging dishes or whatnot, but also provides an interesting premise. We've talked about possibly filming indoors of just how do you cope with being in quarantine? How do you not go crazy with being stuck inside all day, every day? So does anyone want to share the story that they're starting to develop and see if maybe Chairman has some thoughts and ideas for?
Let me just talk about the scenarios that you've set up. Is that
Sure.
one of the things you have to look at as a filmmaker, and if you have a script coordinator, this becomes much easier, but it is repeatability. And when you get to the editing room, you will not believe how many times you'll get there and you realize that the shot that you want to cut to maybe is going to be a little discordant because your actor didn't repeat the actions from the wide shot. So like they picked up the cup with their left hand in the wide shot, but in the close-up, they actually lifted their fork and put it in their mouth. So that's another thing, is that you have to have your actors be able to repeat the motions if you're going to be doing wides and close-ups and medium shots, so that you can cut them together more easily in the editing room.
There's always those bloopers where, you know, in 1 second a character is wearing a red shirt, and then they cut away to who they're talking to, and it cuts back and suddenly they're wearing a blue shirt. And so somehow that got lost in the mix.
Or they have a tie in one shot, and then the tie is loose in another shot, and then it's completely gone in another shot. And it's all the same scene, and they haven't actually done anything. Yeah.
Questions? This is your opportunity to talk to a genuine Hollywood actor, to delve into either behind the scenes Hollywood stories or some advice for all of the filming that we're going to be doing tomorrow. Our schedule, Chairman, so you know, yesterday was all about storytelling and developing the story. Today has been all about script development and actual shooting. Tomorrow is going to be a day off with no sessions, where they go out and they actually film what they've been developing. Thursday, we're going to talk about editing. And Friday, we're going to look at rough cuts of everything. And then everyone's going to go back over the weekend and further refine stuff. And one person out of this group is going to win a cash prize and have their short film included in the Klamath Independent Film Festival.
Awesome.
So Chairman was actually one of our awards judges. So he knows the winners come September, or at least
well,
I'm not sure if
I have my choices. I don't know.
Right. Well, yeah, I don't think I actually told the awards judges who won, but there's definitely I don't know. Did you have a personal favorite, Chairman?
I really liked was it Frank and Zed, the puppet?
Oh yeah,
film?
we have a feature length film that is done entirely with puppets. That is like if you took Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein and mixed it with Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal, and also made it a loving tribute to the old Universal classic horror films like Wolfman and Frankenstein and Dracula and all that.
Maybe a little bit of Tim Burton in there as well.
Yeah, it's crazy, but it's very fun. We did get a question through our chat room from Nick. It says, can you speak to the differences between stage and screen acting, and what is the most important thing to keep in mind?
The differences between stage and screen acting have a lot to do with size and speed. In a live situation, you tend to be able to, you tend to kind of have to keep a pace going. There's no artificial way to do that. You can do that with cutting in film. But on stage, the actor controls the pace. In film, pretty much the director and the editor control the pace, and you can have your actors speed up and slow down to help you in the editing room. But yeah, the pace is one thing. You know, and projection is another. Thing is that with the mic placement, an actor can be very whispery on film, but that's not going to cut it on stage. And then also size. There's a thing that you can do on film because the camera is right there. You can make little choices with your eyes, very subtle things that the camera can pick up. But on a stage, the furthest person away from you might be 25 yards away, and a little tiny look like that is not going to be visible to them. So you kind of have to do things like, something a little bigger, or like
overactor.
Yeah, but the thing is, it's not overacting. If you can make a logical choice that has a character where your character would do that, it's not overacting. My friend Alexandra Billings, fantastic actress. She was on Broadway as Mrs. Morrible. You might know her from the show Transparent. It says there is no top, so you cannot go over it as long as your choices are grounded in reality. So
We talked a little bit earlier today about perspective, as
Mhm.
far as, you know, when a camera has a fixed length, like using the example of like how they filmed Lord of the Rings to make the halflings
Yeah.
look small, when really it's just people sitting like 3 feet apart, but looking like they're looking at each other. So perspective also has a much different play on stage versus with a camera too, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's you really can't fake those things. I mean, you can do certain things with perspective, with the size of scenery and things like that. There was a show that I used to do when I was first got to LA. I was a puppeteer at Universal Studios, and we had a show called The American Tail Show, which is basically the movie American Tail, the animated movie. And there were all of these like 5 foot tall actors running around, dancers running around the stage in mouse costumes, and 3 of us puppeteering a 30-foot tall puppet of a cat. And so you can do stuff like that with perspective on stage, but it's very difficult to pull off. Much easier to do that in film. Yeah.
Do we have other questions for Chairman?
Yeah, I have a question about consistency between shots, like
Mhm.
with your movements, I guess.
Mhm.
Do you have any techniques that you use for keeping your movement consistent?
Rehearsal. If you have the luxury of being able to rehearse the scene with your actors so that they know what you need or what you want them to do and when, that is incredibly helpful to an actor. Some actors don't like to rehearse, but you as the director, you have that choice to, either make them or just tell them exactly what you need them to do. So yeah, just practice is rehearsal. That's about the only tip that I have for that.
That makes sense.
Especially if it's a complicated scene. I mean, it's just like choreographing a fight scene, which it is much more involved. It involves people's safety. But if you're doing a dinner scene and you're at the dinner table, you practice that. Hand him the gravy on that line. Pour your drink on that line. Make sure that there's nothing in your mouth before you say this, or make sure there is something in your mouth when you say this. Yeah, and just practice that, rehearse it.
Whatever your script calls for that you have specifically
Yeah.
developed in Keltex. That's why Andrew was going into all of that minutia detail of describing the actions as much as possible. The parentheticals in a script. And Chairman knows exactly what I'm talking about. The more detail there is to define a character. We talked about that yesterday in our storytelling, that you don't want to drop in character traits 50 pages into a script. It needs to be upfront, where the first time a character is being introduced, you're going to detail, here is their personality trait, here is what they act like, here's kind of what they think, and drop in those parentheticals so that the actor knows, here's the vibe that I'm trying to emulate in my actions.
Yeah. And a lot of that character stuff, there's one way, the way the actor breaks down the script is that they look at it and they say, okay, what do I say about myself? And what do I do? What are the actions that I take that might be in line with or contradict those things that I say about myself? What do other people say about me? Those are the 3 things that we primarily look at when we're breaking down a script and trying to fill out the details of the character that we're playing.
Anyone else want to chime in with a question? Otherwise, it'll just be Chairman and I talking, because I haven't had a chance to talk to my buddy here in like a decade. So I moved away from LA in 2014. That seems like it was yesterday, but it was 6 years ago.
It's funny, since the lockdown, my wife and I have been going out and walking a lot. And it seems like every other time we go out, we run into Bobby Bogner, who lived about 1.5 miles away. Who's a good friend of both of ours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bobby was the lead singer in a band that I met while I was in college, and I would run into Chairman at their concerts most times when they played. So
yeah.
Now I think he runs a restaurant now, right?
He is actually head of catering at Sony Pictures right now.
Oh, wow, good for him.
He had a restaurant over by where Anonymous Content is home based over in
I think
Culver.
yeah, I was going to say Culver City because that was right where I was living for a while. It was like just over by Hamilton High School. So
Yeah, so he closed that down a few years ago, and then he got a job not too long ago. He was working at Huntington Library as head of catering there, and now he's at Sony Pictures.
I'm sure this is utterly fascinating for everyone on here. But if you don't ask a question, this is where the direction of the conversation is going to go.
Well, that's a weird thing is that Bobby is like such an interesting person because he's worked in so many different facets of the entertainment industry. He's been behind the scenes in catering. He's also been on camera talent in History Channel show.
Yeah, he did. He hosted a TV show on the History Channel about food and kind of how food is developed and kind of the behind the scenes. I remember he went to the what was it, the like the hot sauce factory down in Louisiana.
Yeah, Tabasco.
And, like,
Tabasco factory.
Yeah, he went to the Tabasco factory. He couldn't even like walk in without his eyes just starting to water from the amount of pepper.
Yeah. But he's also been in a band. He's had that band's music used in film and television. So there's so many different aspects to the entertainment industry that you really don't even think about until you're here and you realize, oh yeah, somebody's got to do that, don't they?
I have a
It looks
lighting
like
question.
Nick. Okay, yeah. So Nick and Hannah, I think both want to chime in.
Oh, great. Sorry. Give it to Hannah, please.
Oh, I was just going to ask about character development. You were talking about the different questions that you ask as like an exercise.
Yeah.
Can you repeat those?
Yeah, going through there, the actor typically analyzes the script and looks at what does the character say about himself, what does the character do, what are the actions that character takes that either support or in contrast with the things that they say about themselves, and what do other characters say about that character, either to that character or to other characters. So are those things true? Are they not true? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they self-interesting, or are they what's the word I'm looking for? Like charitable, or
Kind, friendly,
kind, yeah,
nice.
Yeah. So
that thing.
Because very often, people will say one thing and do another. Does my character do that? Do other people say that, say things about me that are that contrast with what I say about myself?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And if you want to have an
Nick,
interesting character, make them say one thing about themselves and do something else. So
Yeah.
Nick wanted to chime in with what sounded like a writing question.
I had a question, honestly, more for the sake of filling space, but a lighting question, since that's what we were talking about most of today. Why in the world would someone use primarily like green lighting for a show? There's a show that I've been watching, primarily their color palette is in like greens and grays, and it is so deeply bizarre to look at.
Is it a sci-fi show?
Not. It's more horror, to be honest.
Okay, I've seen a lot of films that either lean in the horror or sci-fi genres that want to give that look that will take you out of your comfort zone, and using more bluish hues or greenish tones can help kind of offset you from what feels like status quo and normal. Chairman, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that sounds right. It's green. Green to me is kind of I think is sort of an upsetting color, kind of a color that kind of denotes just a sense of unease.
Yeah, that tracks. That definitely tracks.
What's the show? Do you mind saying?
It's Hannibal. Yeah,
Which one?
Hannibal.
Oh, the show Hannibal. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely the show Hannibal. They want to keep people kind of back on the back foot.
I mean, it is disturbing in every sense of the word, and yeah. So the idea of trying to create an atmosphere of just general unease would definitely track with that.
There's a lot of different factors that you can use to create a sensation. There's of course the direct visual, but then you can adjust the colors to give something a little offsetting. There's the sound, which we haven't talked about much, but we will talk about on Thursday, where you can take things, whether it's music that's very bombastic and bright, like, you know, say Star Wars, or something that's much more atonal and subtle, like the movie Dunkirk did a fantastic job of creating a constant tension, even when there wasn't a lot happening on screen. The little ticking time and kind of a soft drone created this constant sense of nerves and unease. There's also things like having a camera just slightly off tilt can create a little sense. It's a really terrible film, but a great example of that is Battlefield Earth, the sci-fi film. The cameras were always just slightly askew, and it created this sense of, you know, the bad guy aliens were like larger and dominant, and the humans were like cowarding, because this camera was, you were always like almost sort of doing this to try to watch the film. But those are little kind of subtle things that you can do that when combined, they create this overall sense of ease. If you're doing one poorly, it really stands out and it kind of ruins the experience. But if you can balance all of them in the same way that we were talking about, that the triangle between shutter speed, ISO, to find that happy balance between all the different factors, it can really be impactful.
Yeah, as far as the camera angle and a not so subtle example is the old Batman television series. So whenever they're on Bruce Wayne or Batman, the camera is rock solid. Whenever they're in a villain's lair, it is canted and tilted and at a very odd angle and in a very exaggerated way. So it's really easy to pick up.
That's really
We haven't
cool.
heard yet. Yeah, we haven't heard yet from Nolan or Mary Jane. Do either of you have a question? Or not? That's totally okay. I realize the last 2 days have been a lot to absorb. So
I will say one thing, that if I know this is, you're probably not going to be able to do this right now, but if you're into film and film directing and you want to be more of an actor's director, I would highly recommend that you find some acting classes to take. If you're near a community college that, you know, offers courses, you might be able to take some very cheaply there. They're also independent. I know Oregon has a very vibrant acting community up there, so you might be able to just find people that teach classes, you know, sometime during the week, you know, during the off hours or whatever. But I think being able to take some scene study class will give you a great insight into how actors think and how they work, and the vocabulary that you might need to speak to them. Now, some actors, you may not have to direct very much. That, you know, they say 90% of the job of a director is casting. When you're on the set with the right actors, you don't have to give them much direction unless you need them to go faster, you need them to go slower, you need them to be louder, softer, you need them to stand up on a certain line or whatever. But as far as finding that motivation or, you know, bringing life to the character, you know, you cast the right people, that just takes care of itself. Also, there are, you know, even if you don't have like a great number of friends around you who are actors, there are lots of tools that you can use. There are different casting sites that you can use. There's Actors Act. Well, you would be using, from your perspective, using a site called Breakdown Express, where you could post details about your project. There's also casting networks. There's a site called Backstage, where you can post your details of your project and find actors who are willing to work for cheap or for a copy of the final product to use as demo material. Even union actors, even established actors.
Chairman's in Los Angeles, and he knows about the vibrant acting scene in Oregon. So that shows the kind of quality that's available here. There's a lot of film production that's done in the Portland area. Ashland is, of course, world famous for its annual Shakespeare Festival.
Yeah.
Here in Klamath, the historic Ross Raglan Theater here every summer does a teen acting camp, and they do a community theater production every August. There are opportunities for people who are interested in being on camera as opposed to behind camera to get out there and be more actively involved in it. People that will help you along the way. There's opportunities here in Klamath. There's great opportunities in National. I mean, everyone knows the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. I mean, that's world famous, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival.
My grandfather, excuse me, my father-in-law actually performed in the Oregon Shakespeare Festival years and years ago with a young up-and-coming actor named Powers Booth, who you might have heard of. But yeah, so yeah, world famous. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow.
Yeah, no, totally fine. Damn you. Well, it's a little after 4 anyway, so we're going to start wrapping things up. So for everyone who's still on the call, remember tomorrow is film day. You don't feel like you need to have every last little thing finished by Thursday morning when we reconvene, but we do want to get as much of our raw footage together as possible. And on Thursday, we'll talk about how to combine that raw footage into whichever video editing software you picked from our pre-packet. And we'll go over a little bit of how to edit and some of the theory behind that and kind of bringing the whole story to a close. But hopefully what we've shown you yesterday and today gives you some great insight for telling the story that you want to tell, how to shoot it, how to light it, and how to appear in it. So Chairman, any final words of advice or any final thoughts for folks whose brains are going a mile a minute right now trying to keep up with all the information we've thrown at them?
Don't be afraid to make mistakes. There's one thing about acting is that there's no one right way to do it. So just, try something, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it's a lesson for the next time. Just, don't be afraid to try something and see how it works.
Terrific. Anyone else want to chime in? Nick, Mary Jane, Hannah, Joni, Nolan, this is your last chance. Going, gone. Mary Jane.
I just wanted to thank you. I enjoyed the session very much.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Mary Jane is one of our Klamath film members as well. And so, Mary Jane, I have talked to Chairman about possibly being one of our featured guests at a future meeting. So you may get a chance to kind of pick his brain a little bit more at some point down the line.
I'd like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
We bring in a wide variety of people for our member meetings once a month. I've brought in a music composer, a director, a producer. We've brought in all sorts of different people, writers, and every month just kind of have an open forum, AMA style chat with all of our local members. And we have a very eclectic group, not just here in Klamath, but all across Oregon, especially Southern Oregon, multitaskers who are producers / writers / actors, directors, music composers on the side. Yeah, so a very eclectic group.
I've worked on a number of 48-hour films. I don't know if that's still even going. I think they've changed their format, but the 48-hour film format is excellent for kind of learning what is important on a film shoot, because you learn that tell your story as quick as possible, as few locations as possible, keep the group small. The more people that you have on a group, the longer it takes to film. So try and keep your crew small And if people have to multitask and wear a couple of different hats, that's all the better, because it means that you can move along much faster. Because once you get somebody who specializes in something, they're not going to want to let you film until it's perfect. But if people are wearing several different hats, they've got too many plates to keep in the air for it to get to perfect. So you'll get to shooting much faster.
Yeah, exactly. So everybody hang in there, and please, if you get stuck at any point, or if you want us to reiterate something, I'll post the videos of all of our meetings again, and I'll post the PowerPoint slides so you can access those. But if you have any questions at all, do not hesitate to text me, call me, email Andrew, reach out to us. Rather than getting stuck and getting stressed, we would rather help you in whatever you need in order for you to be able to complete your project. We want you to be able to finish your film this week. Okay?
Good luck to all of you.
Much.
Okay, so Chairman, thanks so much. Great to see you. It's been far too long. If I ever actually make it back down to LA again, we need to grab a beer or something. And or if you're up in Oregon for some reason, hit me up. And I will see everyone on Thursday for our next session, and hopefully with some footage ready to edit. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chairman.
Bye-bye.
We'll see everyone on Thursday.